So I do a lot of briefings for vendors to give them a sense of what's going on in the market. The first question I always get asked is, how big is the market? How many MSPs are there? And the honest answer is none of us really know. Like, any of us as analysts should be telling you that ultimately we're not really sure how many MSPs there are. It's difficult to get. There's a lot of different sources, but ultimately, because we don't have any known way to track that, we can't necessarily pin it down. Now, I've got a couple of different lenses that I like to use in order to give some kind of perspective to that. So the first lens that I'm always focused on here is the Forrester lens of things. So Forrester in 2019, through Jay McBain, put out this particular image. And this gives us a little bit of an overview based on that particular time. Now, he's focusing on the idea of, at the core, there are those that are delivering traditional IT services, VARs, MSPs, MSSPs. There's a group of influencers on top of that, and then there are other spaces around that that we can't track in quite the same way. So, for example, technology channels like telcos, print, AV, those spaces, those shadow channels like digital agencies, CPAs, another area that we can't necessarily track. Now, he's updated that information. So for 2020, we've got a new version of that. He's taken a new way of modeling it, and more importantly, he's giving us a sense of where the growth is. So those areas that are new, emerging technologies, ISVs, as a services companies, that's the main growth area. We think MSP is more stable or slight decline, but there's distinct decline in those other spaces. Note those MSSPs, now the ones that are specifically focused on technology services, are growing. We've got those accounting firms that look a lot like the MSPs and the pieces around that. Additionally, I want to highlight the expanding channel ecosystem and the idea of ecosystems. There's a lot of key players in this space that you may not be tracking through a traditional lead generation model. So, for example, influencers and how they influence the decision. A trusted business partner, someone that's only engaging from an advice perspective. Those are examples of influencers and ambassadors that are ones you're going to want to consider in your channel strategy. Because in order to get access to the people, the end customers that you want to acquire, some of them may be buying direct or maybe buying just based on influence. That's something that you want to be aware of. Now, I get asked also, what do they look like? What do things look like pre-pandemic? Let's take a look at them first from a by revenue perspective. So this is a sense of what's happening. I've drawn a big red line in there to sort of show you the difference between larger than 5 million and less than 5 million. I'm always quoting the fact that the vast majority are smaller than 5 million. We're seeing that right here in terms of where they are in the bulk. They're living in that space between about 200,000 and 5 million or so. It's a nice little even distribution there. They're smaller on the other side of that. Additionally, again, it falls into those two groups. We can definitely see that there's a majority that are dealing with typically around between 10 and 50 or so end customers. Then there's another group that deals with larger than that. I find it interesting to note that there's this little gap. Those ones that have a typical piece, those are the ones that are working to get to the other side. You either live on one end or you live on the other. Additionally, from a growth rate perspective, you're either growing or you're not. And by the way, a lot aren't really growing. That's important to note when we talk about this. We're always talking about this whole space as like a huge growth area. Sure, in aggregate, there's lots of opportunity here, but let's observe that most are increasing by about 5% a year. That's the actual realistic number that we're seeing when it comes to managed services growth. When we look at them from a service leadership perspective and kind of mix up the revenue mix and growth, you can see it looks exactly what you kind of thought it would be. A lot of infrastructure services. Now there's some cloud growth. You can see that getting bigger over time. That's the bit that we're going to drill into a little bit later. Additionally, when we look at them by number of clients by geo, it's kind of what you expected it to see. The majority of them, less than 100 clients. That's what we're expecting to see. That's the typical managed services profile. By the way, They've been around a while. This is a key takeaway for me when I think about the age of the businesses. When I looked at this data from 2019 and compared it to the 2020 numbers, I find it interesting to me that the number less than 3 years old is less now. This is a group of businesses that are aging. I note intentionally not necessarily using maturing, I'm using aging. They've been around for a while and we haven't seen necessarily more new ones. We can measure them by the number of employees. Again, I'm using Datto's reference here. A little note for you, the folks at Managed Sales Pros have said that of the 22,000 known MSPs they had in their database, about 5,000 of them have more than 6. Remember the other way of saying that? 17,000 MSPs in their database, less than 6 employees. These are smaller businesses. End client distribution, again, you're falling on one side of the divide or the other. You're generally dealing with smaller customers or you're dealing with the bigger ones. And by the way, again, look at that. When we're sampling this space, people responding to this style of poll, they are dealing with customers less than 500 users. Now, let's talk about what COVID-19 has done to the market because it scrambles some of the data. I got to start by observing we can know what a lot of these are going to look like. This Twitter image makes me laugh every single time I look at it because this is all of the research that I've been looking at almost always looks exactly like this. If you're wondering what happened, it looks like this. Things dropped off and they aren't getting better until a few years out. We're seeing this from all of the projections. What's interesting to me is when we ask the MSPs themselves what they think about this, they actually were pretty consistent. They didn't drop off in terms of their thoughts on the way they're going. Anybody that knows and listens to my show knows that I tend to be much more pessimistic on this. Let me observe that I don't necessarily think asking MSPs about their own sense of the economic outlook is a great source of data because they're not necessarily looking at all of the details of the trends, and we know they may not necessarily always be the savviest operators. Additionally, we know that most of these businesses don't have the cash on hand. Now, let's dive into some actual numbers, again, looking at it from a service leadership perspective. Those that were performing, that are in the top quartiles and are doing well, continue to do well the earlier part of this year. If you were struggling, you struggled more. Again, if you've listened to any of my show, you know that I'm constantly talking about the fact that I look at COVID as an accelerant. Here's the data. How did the bottom quartile do? Again, you know that I'm thinking not as much about the people at the top. I think the top performers are killing it, and they don't necessarily need advice from guys like me. What we need to look at is the guys in the medium, and I think about the guys at the bottom. They had a rougher time of this. Now, they actually were having a rougher time of it last year too. So let's note that that's something of important to know, that they were struggling, and they're coming into that struggling even more. The best in class, however, are the ones that made the adjustments. There were a lot of savvy owners at the top end of this market that have made corrective actions. That is to be complimented. It is a big win, and it is one you're going to be seeing from your top performing partners. Now, when we looked at it, they actually was a survey in terms of looking at the quarterly bookings. This is from the TSIA. They actually did a rapid response research study to understand what was going on. They actually are noting that it's the on-site work that was significantly impacted. A lot of that moved into the into remote work, which we did see a considerable amount of increase in. Obviously, we see a portion of the market that was flat, about 18%. That's interesting to note from that perspective. And again, I am noticing that some of the drop-offs are in the market. Now, this is where things get really interesting to me because I want to understand what's happening in cloud resale. So, mid of the way in COVID, this is again looking from the Q1, Q2 performance from this year. The biggest thing that I'm looking at that's striking to me is that the best in class MSPs are the ones doubling down on cloud. You can see it right here. They're the ones that are diving in saying, I'm going to make the investment. They are pulling ahead. So if you want to look for something that you can understand their best behavior in, it's this data point. The ones that are performing and starting to pull away from a performance perspective are the ones that are investing in cloud. Here's the other piece that I take a look at, and we can align that. It's a simple question. If they're able to say that they strongly agree that they have specific growth goals for their business, from my perspective, that's an easy understanding of best in class. If you don't have specific goals, shockingly, you're not necessarily going to improve. Now, the data, I've overlaid my opinion because this is something that you can actually use to understand what's going on there. But I think this is a key understanding. We talk all the time about business performance. They're not setting specific goals and strongly agree that they do. That's going to be your clear indicator. Also, about 63% of the market not planning headcount adjustments. By the way, this is good, right? This is a good piece to it. I do want to note, though, however, 20% of the market is reducing down, 17% moderately, so during this. So we are going to know that some of these pieces, again, likely correlating with the underperformers in the market. From a cancellation perspective, kind of similar numbers. But we're seeing those again, about 25% are seeing cancellation in contracts. This is again something that you want to be careful of because you as the vendor are likely insulated from some of this, and you want to be understanding of the fact that your customer is dealing with this. Now, take a quick moment to talk about how you specifically find MSPs. Thought I would take a quick moment and give you a sense of what I'm seeing from a media landscape. The joy is that it's from across the board. There is nobody in here where they're specifically saying these are the dominant place where people are finding their news and information. I would be remiss if I didn't observe that this research data came out before I was even necessarily a possibility, so I didn't expect to see myself within this metric. The main takeaway for me is you need to be in more than one place, that you're going to be spreading out the messaging because different people are consuming information from different locations. And again, I wanted to highlight for you Jay McBain's community engagement strategy. Some of you that have been engaging with me are the ones that have been really performing well in this space. You need to be visible every day in all of the places where your partners are. Thanks for listening. If you like it, go ahead and hit like. Hit that subscribe button. I do a ton of material covering the IT services market, and I deliver a daily podcast called The Business of Tech, which is all the news about technology through the lens of those IT service providers. So if you're interested in learning more, you can listen to the issues that matter to them and go from there. There's videos here on the YouTube channel giving you insights into the kind of issues that they are providing and what they're thinking about in terms of the way they deliver their services. If you need more information, go ahead and visit mspradio.com. You can reach out and get in touch with me, and I'm always happy to answer more questions. Thanks for listening.